Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Georgianne. Something is happening in our world. The masses of people are rising up, and wherever they are assembled today, whether they are in Johannesburg, South Africa, Nairobi, Kenya, Accra, Ghana, New York City, Atlanta, Georgia, Jackson, Mississippi, or Memphis, Tennessee, the cry is always the same: we want to be free. Let us rise up tonight with greater readiness. Let us stand together with a greater determination. And let us move on in these powerful days, these days of challenge, to make America what it ought to be. These, of course, are words that are hopeful words that are spoken by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. at Mason Temple Church on April the 3rd, 1968, in Memphis, Tennessee, less than 24 hours before he will be killed by an assassin on a balcony at the Lorraine Motel. So what we thought we would do today is give you a slice of what happens back in Alabama after King's assassination. We thought we would take the words and the images that are in a small but significant newspaper, the Southern Courier, and give you a snapshot of how they covered the life and work of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. After his death. So that is the paper and the preacher. To start with, we'll give you a little background on the Southern Courier itself. So the Courier starts in the minds of two former Harvard Crimson editors, Peter Cummings and Ellen Lake. And so both of these individuals participated in Freedom Summer in Mississippi, and both of them with journalism backgrounds were a little aghast at how most Southern newspapers had covered the civil rights movement up to that point, particularly Freedom Summer. And so this idea of a newspaper devoted to civil rights and economic improvement matters comes to comes into being because they work together on it. They enlist the help of a few of their colleagues at Harvard, and they get about $30,000 to start this program. Most of it comes from a Ford Foundation grant, but there are quite a few donors who give money, particularly after March and April of 1965, after the events in Selma. So Cummings and Lake are raising money to start the Courier. They're trying to recruit staff all as the events in Selma are unfolding. They get their Ford Foundation grant, and they set up shop first in Atlanta and start making plans to publish their paper in early 1965. This gentleman here is Michael Lotman. He was also a former Harvard Crimson reporter. In the spring of 1965, he's working at the Chicago Daily News as a beat reporter. Cummings and Lake recruit him to be the editor-in-chief for the Courier, a position he holds throughout the entire 177 issues of the paper. And so the first issue comes out in July of 1965, and this is the opening editorial that they put forward, and I just want to read a few pieces of it for you. This really encapsulates the entire purpose of the Courier in a quite succinct way. Obviously, it's a paper for the people. It says it's an independent newspaper. Our only responsibility is to our readers, the people of Alabama. And our chief concern is the crucial problems that confront Alabamians. Later on, they list sort of a set of beliefs, that basic principles that operate within the walls of the Courier. It says, we believe that all men are entitled to the equal protection of the laws and the equal justice in the courts. We believe that all men are entitled to equal educational opportunities. We believe that the interests of all people are best served by a democratic system of government, and this means that all men, regardless of race, color, or creed, are entitled to the right to vote. This is in their opening editorial. In the next paragraph, it says, with these principles in mind, the Southern Courier cannot ignore the fact that most of Alabama's Negroes are denied these basic equalities. Therefore, we will publish information to help erase the injustice of segregation and prejudice. Later on, it says it's a new newspaper. It's experimental in many ways, and it wants to respond to its readers. And so its readers are as they've just stated, sort of a different lot than what they presumed were the normal readers of the daily newspapers throughout the South. In the pages of the Courier in all 177 issues. As you can see, this is an expanded view of page 2 of the first issue. Martin Luther King looms quite large. He has a presence, literally, they're online searchable versions of every issue of the Courier, and you cannot find a single one where there is not some news-related item related to King or the SCLC or some work that's going on in Alabama or Georgia or Mississippi related to something that Dr. King or his organization are doing. And so this is very much appropriate that we focus on this particular newspaper and its relationship with Martin Luther King Jr. In December of 1965, they published a front-page editorial by Dr. King about the Montgomery bus boycott. They also published one that Ms. Parks wrote as well. So this is the first real, this is the only real time where you see King's direct involvement with the newspaper. But of course, they quote from his speeches. They send reporters to cover his events. They send Jim Peppler, the photographer, and David Underhill, one of the reporters, to cover the March Against Fear, the James Meredith March in Mississippi. And so they, of course, have a very important role to play in showing the progression of the last few years of King's life and that portion of the movement to a large portion of black and white Alabamians who are reading the paper. The subscription to begin with is about 15,000. That quickly doubles. And of course, these are newspapers that are passed around, and so it's difficult to sort of get an exact figure on the amount of people who read it, but it was something that was a communal sort of publication, so to speak. And so some of the events that they covered, of course, not only issues related to voting, but also the war on poverty, issues related to agriculture, rural life in Alabama, particularly in the Black Belt, war on poverty initiatives and other federal initiatives and how they intersected with black Alabamians in some of the poor portions of the state. A very interesting contrast to how school desegregation fights to change forms of government, the impact of federal registrars. All these things are covered with a slightly different hue in the Courier than they are in some of Alabama's older, more well-established, and more conservative, racially conservative newspapers. And so this sort of the switch from the rural to the more industrial economy in certain parts of the state is something that they really hang their hat on as well. So it's quite the for the readers of the time it was quite useful. It was quite new, but for historians it's invaluable to have this view of a critical point in Alabama's history. So of course, they cover several events. This is an editorial they wrote in April of 1967. This is after King's famous speech in New York on April 4th, 1967, 1 year to the day exactly before he'd be assassinated, where he comes out against the war in Vietnam. And so this is something that's not necessarily unexpected by the Courier. They had been leaning that direction themselves for quite some time and had written more editorials as well. But there's a line at the bottom of this where they say, Dr. King's critics say there is no connection between the Vietnam War and civil rights. And then they go on to cite the same statistics that King had cited in his April 4th speech about disproportionate numbers of African Americans being drafted, and also about millions upon millions of dollars being diverted from war on poverty, anti-poverty initiatives to fight the war in Vietnam. It says the NAACP and others have called Dr. King's anti-war remarks a, quote, serious tactical mistake. Has it occurred to anyone that Dr. King took his stand because he thought it was right? If it's a tactical mistake to speak up when you think you're right, what is it to keep silent when you know something is wrong? So this is also a very, we should say, plain-spoken paper. This is not the old gray lady. They don't fly to high rhetorical heights. They tell you what has happened. There are several headlines after elections that just simply say who won or what's happening now, and it's a very plain-spoken paper And that of course is important. They don't really pull any punches. They don't leave you wondering where they stand. They are very direct in all that they do. Just a couple more people. This is Mary Ellen Gale over on the far right. She's an associate editor. And this, of course, this shows you sort of the position that they occupy. Most of the reporters that we have for the Courier at this point are quite young. Most of them early on are from somewhere else. That changes as the paper continues to proceed. More of their local reporters are integrated in their communities. More of their local reporters are from there, and so the paper starts to sort of shift in the demographics of the people who are writing for it. That's also true of Barbara Howard Flowers, who's a longtime reporter with them. She starts as a typist, I believe, and then moves on to writing features and stories. Mary Ellen Gale, in addition to being an editor, she covered sort of the area between Montgomery and Tuskegee. So she writes some quite important stories along that line. So. And the last thing I'll mention before we turn it over is the offices. The offices of the Courier are here in Montgomery. They started in Atlanta, but they moved to Montgomery shortly after the first issue was published. If you're familiar with downtown, where the Mellow Mushroom is now, that's around the spot where their offices were. Clifford and Virginia Durr were early patrons and supporters. In fact, Michael Lotman called them the godparents of the Southern Courier. So they're reporters who are staying in their homes, and they're getting financial and moral support from the Durrs all that time. And so the reporters, are covering the state and doing quite well. But then, of course, there's the great imagery that you get from the Southern Courier, and that's what Meredith's going to tell you about.
Jim Peppler, a native of Pennsylvania, arrived in Montgomery to work for the Southern Courier fresh out of graduate school. This was his first journalism position and also his first time in the South. Initially, he planned to stay for 3 months, but that turned into 3 years. And from July of 1965 to the spring of 1968, he served as the paper's principal photographer and photo editor. Like the Courier itself, Peppler's work spanned the journalistic spectrum from hard news to human interest. And the photographs that he and others contributed to the paper added a dimension to the stories that words alone could not convey, particularly when covering renowned topics, events, figures that were so far removed from the daily lives of the average readers. King was a regular subject, and Peppler followed him to events throughout the state and even into Mississippi. In 1968, Peppler left Alabama to take a job at Newsday in New York. And when he did, he took with him a large collection of negatives that he had produced while working at the Courier, which he carried with him for the next 4 decades. During those 40 years, he matured as a journalist, and he developed a rather unique philosophy about his work. He came to believe that photographers share ownership with the subjects in their pictures, without whom they would have no images. And so when he started looking for a permanent home for his collection, he wanted a repository that would not only provide adequate care for the physical material, but also wide public access to it. And fortunately for all of us today, the Alabama Archives had both the interest and the resources to fulfill his wishes. So in 2009, Mr. Peppler donated over 11,000 negatives to the archives, and all of those have since been scanned and added to our online digital collections. And if you've not taken the time to do this, I strongly encourage you to explore this resource. It's wonderful. Hardly a week goes by that I don't hear from somebody wanting to use an image or with a new identification, a new name for a face, which is what we want. So please take some time. You'll see all of the images that we're looking at today, as well as a host of other topics. Just be sure to give yourself some time, because once you start looking, it's easy to get lost in them for a few hours. And
we speak from experience on that point. We've lost days looking at the Peppler images. They're so great. I thought what I'd do is just give a brief summary of the events in Atlanta that the Courier, that its reporters and Jim Peppler, the photographer, are covering and then reporting back. The date is important on this issue because the Courier is a weekly paper, and they put the paper together and ship it out on a Wednesday. So Dr. King is assassinated on a Thursday, so you have that explains the gap in time. So King's funeral in Atlanta is on April the 9th, 1968, and so the day before and for the morning of the 9th, King's body lies in state in a glass-covered coffin at Atlanta's Spelman College. And so once that is over, they will begin the actual services on the day of his funeral. But there are 60,000 people who viewed King's body at Spelman College. There's a private service at Ebenezer Church at 10:30 that morning. This is attended by members of the family, civil rights activists, and dignitaries and politicians. There are about 1,000 people that are invited. There are about 1,300 people in the church that day, which is, if you've ever been in the old Ebenezer Church, you know is quite a lot for that space. And so then after the private funeral at Ebenezer, then you have the 3.5 mile very slow funeral cortege that goes from Ebenezer down Auburn Avenue, snakes its way through downtown Atlanta, and goes to Morehouse College, where there will be a public funeral. There were estimated 150,000 people that gathered around Ebenezer and along that route, and so that's what you'll see in the images, just a large group of people. So there's a public service at Morehouse, which is followed initially by King's interment at Southview Cemetery. Now, if you know Atlanta, if you know the King Center, you know that Dr. King and now his wife are buried there on site at the King Center. That happens in 1977. So initial interment for King is in the predominantly African-American Southview Cemetery. So this is, I'll just sort of walk through the next two issues of the Courier and show you in print how they covered the funeral. Of course, the large headline at the top of the first issue, King buried in Atlanta, I tried to love somebody. That's a quote directly from King from the Drum Major Instinct speech that he gave at Ebenezer a few months before his death. This, of course, is King's own eulogy. This is the recording that's played of him giving the sermon at the funeral. He said, if you say anything about me, say that I tried to love somebody. Say that I was a drum major for justice, these sorts of things. So there's a reminder there of what has happened before. Mary Ellen Gale attends the services in Atlanta. She writes 3 stories on the front page of that issue, the main one being here, King lies in state. I told you about the plain-spoken nature of the reporting that we have in the Courier, but there were some lines. There's some lines on this page that were quite good and quite poetic. Here's Gail describing the scene outside of Spelman College as she left there on her way back to Ebenezer for the private funeral. From the white-columned Sisters' Chapel, where Dr. King's body lay in a glass-covered coffin, an immense line of mourners wove back and forth across the college walks. There were old men in shabby suits, well-dressed middle-aged couples, college students, and mothers and fathers with their young children tugging at their hands. Most of the people were black, but some were white. All of them stood quietly in uncertain sunshine beneath flowering trees and ivy-covered red brick buildings. Uncertain sunshine. And we thought that was quite poetic and quite beautiful. This contrast that you have between this well-manicured lawn of Spelman College. It's spring. The azaleas are in bloom. It's a fairly warm day, and then yet here are all of these mourners, all of them dressed in their finest clothing, whatever that might be. All of them somber, all of them incredibly quiet. That's one of the things that you hear from the reporting is just how quiet every event was at the funeral throughout that day. And this is Mary Ellen Gale coming from Ebenezer Church. You can see it there in the background. So she and Jim Peppler are the only ones from the Courier that are there that day. On page 2, we have an interesting piece that Michael Lotman writes. The date line is Memphis, but this is sort of a collection of some of the most iconic lines from the speeches that King gave from 1955 up until the one he gave the night before his death. And so, when I look at this, I think, 1968 is before 24-hour news. It's certainly before YouTube, anything like that, where you could go if you wanted to and listen to some of these speeches or read an article about King's top 10 speeches. This was something that for the readers of the Courier would have been a sort of memorial record, that showed them the arc of King's career from 1955 until his death. But also, as Lotman pushes forward here on the theme of the dream and what the dream meant to King in 55, what it meant to him in 63, what it meant in 67 and 66 as things started to splinter, but also what it meant now that he was gone. So it's a quite moving compilation of some of his own words, very, very similar in some ways to what we plan on doing here on April 4th. There's a photo collage that Meredith will get back to in a moment. Jim Peppler photos. These are of course King in life, in remembrance of me. This underscores the fact that obviously King is a minister. Most of these photos are taken in a church, but it's also Easter, the Easter season, and so this is sort of reminding the imagery there. The last page of that issue of the Courier is quite interesting because it brings us back to Alabama, and it shows us some of the memorials and marches that are taking place here in the state. And so here's a headline: Tears in Troy, Not in Montgomery. There's a write-up about Tuskegee. 5,000 marching in Tuscaloosa. I want to back up really quickly and just say, first of all, in those three cities, in Montgomery, in Troy, Montgomery, Tuskegee, and Tuscaloosa, there is either no mention of the memorial or march that takes place, no mention in that town's daily or that town's newspaper, or it's a very different sort of story. They're either focused, the other papers are focused on the riots that are happening in some cities. In the case of Tuskegee, they announced that in the case of Tuscaloosa, they announced that there will be a march, but then there's no follow-up story to the fact there were 5,000 people that attended that march. The Montgomery Advertiser talks about the 4,000 people that attended the memorial service at Cramden Bowl, but they don't talk about the 1,000 students from Alabama State that marched from their campus to Dexter and back on the same day. So, like I said, quite different coverage in the Courier, quite important to preserve what had happened there. And Mary Ellen Gale writes the story about the demonstration in Troy. She says, in Troy, 1,000 silent mourners staged the first demonstration in that city's history, a march from the Pike County Courthouse to the First Baptist Church. And then she quotes Johnny May Warren, a participant. She said, if tears had been a river, it would have floated Troy. It was real hurtin'. Where we go from here, I don't know. So again, just the straight, direct quote, quite beautiful. One more I want to show you. It's from Mobile. This is on the same page, page 6, where they talk about the memorial service that the city and the local ministerial alliance sort of hastily organized is disrupted by a woman who had worked with King and the SCLC for a while, a woman named Dorothy P. Williams. And so between some of the speeches by elected officials and local ministers, Dorothy P., as they called her, charges the stage and takes the microphone and talks about how the leadership is rotten and how they had kept Dr. King out of the city and they had kept Dr. King's vision in Mobile from coming forward. And so she's sort of rather roughly yanked off stage, which brings an end to the entire affair because there are so many people in the audience, about 6,000 people there, who have a great affinity for Dorothy P., as she would call it. And so that's the end of the rally. They stand up and all march out and return to marching in the streets, as they had been doing moments before the program started in the auditorium. So, and again, one sentence in a story in the Press Register the next day about a disturbance that ended the program, but nothing as far as the detail, and gives you sort of a sense of what was happening. Dorothy Williams pops up in the Courier again a few days later. She is a participant in the Poor People's Campaign. She goes up to Resurrection City, and she's seen here helping place people in tents. There's a Jim Peppler photograph of Dorothy Williams directing traffic, which is sort of what she would do. And so this gives you, I think, a good glimpse of what's happening back in Alabama in the pages of the Courier. As I said, very important. In the next week's issue, we have again a little more material. You've got a follow-up story with some more of Peppler's photographs, and then you have a larger spread in the newspaper itself. And again, it's Easter season, and so if you can't read it on the screen, those are lines from different hymns. Were You There? Faith of Our Fathers, and then of course, Precious Lord, Take My Hand, which was one of King's favorite hymns. It was sung at the funeral. And so, a compilation of photographs from different portions along the funeral procession, and then at Southview Cemetery as well. So, the memorial record that we have is quite good. And the editorial that week was also interesting. It listed a few memorials for King that had already taken place. It talked about how both Spelman and Morehouse colleges had offered full four-year scholarships to all of the King children. It talked briefly about the quick passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1968, which of course banned discrimination in housing and had a section that stiffened the penalties for threatening to injure civil rights workers and demonstrators. A few other things that it lists there. But it occurs to me that there's a memorial of a different kind that we have today, and it's this wonderful, rich, iconic photo collection that we have from Jim Peppler, only a fraction of which you see in the pages of the Courier. There's hundreds of quite arresting images, and that's what Meredith's going to tell you about.
King's funeral was one of the last major events that Jim Peppler covered before leaving the Southern Courier. He drove through the night to get to Atlanta. He arrived at 3 a.m. and he slept in his car. The next day he worked alone. He carried 2 cameras so he wouldn't have to change out his lenses, and he spent a lot of time on foot down among the mourners. Now, he didn't make it into the church. He didn't make it to most of the afternoon service at the college, but still, altogether, his images, about 550 of them, tell the full story of what happened that day. At Ebenezer Baptist Church, at Morehouse College, and at Southview Cemetery. His family, his fellow leaders. Political figures. Cultural icons. The well-known. The unknown. And the press. They brought their children. And their cameras. They walked. and watched. From rooftops, from windows and balconies, from trees, signs, and utility poles, from vehicles, they stood in the streets, and on hillsides, and at the graveside. They waited, he passed, They remembered.
Thank you very much.
Thank you again, Meredith and Scotty. We have a couple minutes for questions. Today we only have one microphone, though, so if you'll please raise your hand and give us a few minutes, Wesley and I will get it to you. We are recording, so we want to make sure we get your questions.
I may have missed it, but how long did the Courier, when was the last edition of the Courier?
So the last issue of the Courier is December of 1968. So they are 177 issues from July of 1965 through December of 1968.
At any time, was the paper or any of its reporters or photographers threatened in any way?
I don't recall anything about the reporters. Did Jim Peppler say anything?
I know that he was, I think he was attacked at least once, like out on assignment. Yeah. But I don't know of any real effort to go after on a bigger scale. Right. I think his camera got broken. I think he did get beaten up once. Yeah. Like in Prattville or something. Okay. But.
Hi. My name is Viola Bradford.
Miss Van, no
I was the first black reporter for the Courier when I was 14 years old. Sorry. I just learned about this an hour ago. Somebody called me and told me about it. I just moved back here 30 days ago after being in Washington, D.C. for 35 years. I went there to work for the Democratic National Committee. 2 years for the 84 election and with intentions of coming back, and I stayed 35. Ended up working with Congressman Walter Fontrow, who you saw there. I was one of his congressional aides. And I just got back here on the 15th, actually, of January. So I was started working with the Courier when I was 14. Jim Peppler came to my grandmother's house on the west side, Central Street, with Jeffrey Cowan. And two white men to come into the neighborhood on a dead-end black street in 1964 was something else. And they came because they wanted me, they heard I was a writer and liked to write, and asked my grandmother if I could go and start the Courier with them, and that's how I got started with the Courier. I ended up going to the University of Arizona to get a degree in journalism. That's why I wasn't here in '68, because I was graduating at Arizona at that time, and then on my way to UCLA to get my master's in journalism. So my stories are in there. And to answer that question, Jim was on assignment with me in Lowndes County at for the Black Panther election in November 1966. And I was down there covering Stokely Carmichael. He had gotten in jail, and I went to cover him. And while I was there, some things were going on, so I called Jim. Jim came down, and it was the night of the election returns, and Dr. Charles Hamilton, who was down there writing the book with Stokely about the Black Power book. That's when Jim came down and joined me, and the elections were coming back. And anyway, I'll be very short because there's a lot that was going on. And on the way back, he said, Viola, why don't you come back and ride back to Montgomery with me? We were at the Frank Lew building. And I said, Jim, I don't think I better ride back with you tonight. He had that blue Volkswagen. And I just sensed, I don't think I better ride back with you tonight down here from Lowndes County. And just so happens, I ended up staying back with Charles Hamilton and Stokely. And Jim got stopped by some Klansmen and run off the road in a ditch. They took his camera and then exposed the film that he had in it. And I knew that was a threat, and I was glad I wasn't riding with him that night, because I probably wouldn't be standing here today. But to answer that question.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
When the Southern Courier closed down, was there another paper that came along right afterwards to take over from a, I guess, a northern perspective?
No, ma'am. No.
I know the Southern Courier was distributed for Alabamians, but was it published anywhere else or sent off anywhere else?
Well, it was published here, but they expanded into Mississippi and Georgia. They did. Early on, they have a regional scope in mind to begin with, but they pretty quickly narrow it. And in the first issue, they're talking about they're for their readers in Alabama, but they're always covering items that are happening in Georgia and Mississippi. They cover the Meredith March, which is in Mississippi, and they do cover some things in Georgia, particularly around Columbus, and so they still keep sort of a regional approach.
So it was sold there also?
Yes, ma'am.
I don't know if I missed it, but why did the paper end?
They ran out of money. They did. Their Ford Foundation grant ran out, and then at that point, the papers of the Courier, the sort of the institutional papers, are at Tuskegee University Archives, and you can see in them for about 9 months they're trying to find another source of funding. The Ford Foundation is not going to renew their grant, and so on about the 1st of September, Mike Lotman sends a letter to the staff and kind of says, things are not well. It looks like we may have to start closing this down, and encourages people at that point to start looking for other work, and so trying to prepare them for what they think at that point is pretty inevitable. But they do a remarkable job of trying to keep it afloat for as long as they can. But the funds that they got in the wake of the Selma campaign in 1965 were being used for other purposes by 1968, and they just couldn't find a source of funding, and they couldn't afford, with selling the paper for what they sold it at, which was about 10 cents an issue. They just couldn't afford to keep it going. There's advertisements in the paper, but and those are interesting too, because you get African American owned businesses, you get really interesting things from the advertisements, but the rates are pretty low, so they needed the outside support.
All right, well, if there are no more questions, thank you again, Meredith and Scotty, and thank y'all for being here today.